We are now recording. So, everybody, I am Felicia Beardsley. This is University of Laverne's Cultural Natural History Collection's Influential Speaker Series. So, we are going to be beginning, actually, right now, a couple of housekeeping items. Please make sure that you're on mute and recognize we are recording this event. So, if you're unmuted, we can hear everything that's happening in your area, right? I want to welcome you to our speaker series. This series highlights the work of cultural influencers, of thought leaders, of humanitarians, and those who work for social justice. So today, we get to welcome Mr. Pico Iyer, who will be talking to us about envisioning a future in the post-pandemic world. And for those of you who don't know us, the Cultural Natural History Collections is the university's museum, and we are run completely on the generosity of donations. So if you're so inclined, you might want to donate to us, just in case. I'll be putting a link up in the chat just for that, right? One last comment, and that is if you have a question for Pico, please type it into the chat. Some of the questions we've actually received some questions by email already. And so we've been collecting those. And if you do have any questions, again, put them in the chat. Let's hope we get to all of them. We may not, but it'll be time permitting. And with that, we're going to go ahead and begin. So please welcome Pico Iyer and our guest interviewer, Mr. Randy Miller, who's also our speakers coordinator. So Randy, it's your turn now.
Thank you very much, Felicia. Yes, as Felicia mentioned, we are delighted to have Pico Iyer with us for this session. And I wanted to mention too that this series began last fall, and one of the movers and shakers that kind of got this speaker series underway is June Pulcini, who's an alumnus of the University of Laverne. So we're grateful to her for her encouragement and support of this series. And when June and I were coming up with ideas for people to contribute to this, Pico Iyer was one of the first names that we put on the list. And it was such an obvious choice. And I am so delighted that Pico, that you've agreed to do this. This is really a thrill, and we're looking forward to this. Let me just mention a little, some of you might be aware of who Pico Iyer is and what his background is. He's a writer, he's an author and an essayist, has written 15 books to date, I believe, with a couple of books off to the publishers. I came across him, I first came across, I was researching, I was about to make a trip overseas, my first big trip, and I was trying to find out, this was, believe it or not, before the internet, and trying to find everything I could about this, and so I was reading, and I came across this article in Time magazine that was just really full of useful information, and I read it again and again, and I thought, this is really well written, and I made a note of who wrote it. And I don't know, a couple of years later, I noticed that he was going to be speaking at Vroman's bookstore in Pasadena. So I made a beeline over there and met Pico for the first time. And I think it was Falling Off the Map that you were doing a tour to promote at that time. I think that was your third book. And then in the next year or two, I would see him here and there, sometimes at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, but also at other speaking engagements he would have, Vroman's and Pacific Asia Museum in Pasadena. And then over the years, well, we stayed in touch, but I said, well, Pico, do you ever speak at universities? And of course he does. And so I arranged for him to speak. Now this is his first time with the speaker series, but 20 years ago, he came and spoke at the university in person for a week-long international focus, which I believe was on food, which is an area of Pico's expertise. He'll tell you more about that later. But anyway, so he came and spoke on campus then, and we've remained in touch since then. And like I say, it's been a pleasure to learn to know him, and really great to have you here with us, Pico. So let me see. Yeah, as people may know, you grew up in England, but then your parents and you moved to Santa Barbara when you were 9. But you weren't having the California schools. You wanted to go back, and so you commuted back and forth between England. You were going to Eton, I believe, and California. So you had one foot in old world schooling in England and one foot in 60s, 70s California culture. So you had a little bit of both worlds going there. Anyway, you grew up with wanting to be a writer, and you became an essayist for Time, and you were living in New York, and and you continue to contribute to many magazines and write many books since. I could spend, I think, we'll leave it at that. If you want to find out more about this wonderful guide, there's information online. But I think maybe it would be a good idea for us to begin with our questions and just dive right into it. We'll have a few minutes at the end for, as Felicia mentions, for questions contributed by you to the chat room. But I've got a few prepared for Pico related to our topic. So Pico, you a few years ago wrote a book called The Art of Stillness, and you've managed to stay centered in your life, one that has often been a whirlwind of motion and change, not just because you've lived in various places, Japan at the moment and for the past 30 years or so, but you're traveling so often. Um, this past year has been one of the more dramatic years of change and upheaval for people all over the world due to COVID. And I'm wondering what insights you might share with us on coping now and in the coming months, and how do you remain clear and calm these days?
Well, before I say anything, thank you so much, Randy, for such a warm introduction. I'm so excited to see you again. I know you approached me about this for 4 months ago, so I've been looking forward to it ever since. As I look on the screen, I see my old friend in Oakland, California, Robert Hoffman, whom I haven't seen for much too long. So this is actually a reunion on many fronts. I can't say that necessarily I'm very calm or clear, but I can say that I think all of us have found that the pandemic has asked us really one question: what do we care about? What is essential to our lives? And I think it's done a good thing in dramatizing for us what is essential, what sustains us. So I think the obvious thing is that as we prepare to return to our normal lives, we're more keenly aware than we were 15 months ago of what we're missing and what we're keen to do again. But I think the subtler opportunity that the pandemic has opened is, what have we been missing the 15 years before the pandemic? Because many of us have been finding ourselves living very differently, and in certain ways grateful for some of the new habits it's instilled within us. And you were mentioning how I came and spoke about global food at Laverne 20 years ago. And because that was the beginning of the 21st century, I remember when I came, I said I felt that our whole world was like a Porsche that was joyriding around blind curves at an amazingly high speed. And of course, the world has only accelerated since then. And suddenly nature has put up this roadblock. And I don't think that's an entirely a terrible thing, because I think 2 years ago, many of our lives were somewhat out of balance and out of control. And now we have the rare chance to reorient them. Everybody here knows that when you're driving along the 405 and you realize you're going in the wrong direction, the first thing to do is slow down, get off the freeway, stop, and then you can calmly try and turn around. But when you're trying to make a U-turn on the middle of a busy freeway is a recipe for disaster. And I think right now we're all in this really unusual situation where we're relatively stationary. Probably 6 months from now, we'll be back in the fray again. We won't be able to make clear decisions. So this is maybe the one time in our lives when we can think about how we really want to live a little differently. And I was remembering often, I mean, during this last year, how many years ago I was once in my family home in the hills of the Santa Barbara. And I saw this distant line of orange cutting through a hillside. So of course I went down to call the fire department. When I came back up, our house was completely encircled by 70-foot flames that were being whipped on by 70 mile per hour winds. It was the worst fire in Californian history. It had broken out just up the road from us, and I was caught in the middle of it for 3 hours. I grabbed my mother's cat, I jumped into a car to try to escape. And when I got to our mountain road, I saw we couldn't go up and we couldn't go down. The flames were so intense that no fire truck could get to us. And the smoke was so thick, we could hear the helicopters above, but we couldn't see them and they couldn't see us. And actually, at a certain point, I was literally stuck on the road and I was watching the flames pick through our living room and wipe out everything in my bedroom and reduce really my next 3 books to ash. And when at last I was free to drive down, I went to a supermarket, I bought a toothbrush. That was the only thing that I had in the world the next day. So it was really a shock to the system, a little the way the pandemic has been a shock to just about everybody on the planet. But as time developed, I noticed that some of my neighbors were really traumatized for life. I don't think they'll ever recover. But some suddenly saw, well, in certain ways, maybe this can prompt us into new habits and allow us to live a little bit more the way we've always wanted to live. And I think for me, the pandemic has reminded me, humblingly, how little control I have over external events, but also how much control I have over my response. And I think we're created not by what happens to us, but what we make of it. And I can still remember after the fire, at one point I went in and I saw my mother working with the architect, drawing up a plan for a new house. I thought, this is the perfect moment to make a new life. I can live without probably 90% of the clothes and furniture I'd unthinkingly accumulated. I'd lost this book on Cuba I was going to write, non-fictional. I'd lost all my notes. Why don't I try fiction instead, which I'm sure I would have been too shy or scared to do otherwise. I had no physical home in California anymore. Why don't I go to where my heart's home is, Japan? And so in so many ways, although it was a devastating event, at the end of it, maybe 2 years on, I was living much, much closer to the way I'd always thought I ought to live. As you know, I've been talking to the Dalai Lama now for almost half a century. And he always says, uncertainty is possibility. And so I think the pandemic, for me, a time of maximal uncertainty, has also been a time of great possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I've read the fiction book, the first fiction book, I think you wrote, Cuba and the Night, which grew out of that. You lost your notes, couldn't write the nonfiction piece, and it's a wonderful book. I encourage people to read it if you haven't already. Cuba and the Night, a delightful book. Yeah, well, even before COVID came upon us, you had spoken and written about the value of Sabbath rest. The benefits that could be gained from taking a pause to recharge our batteries and take stock of where we are and who we are. And you mentioned you've made a point of doing this yourself several times a year at the Catholic Retreat Center near Big Sur. And COVID brought us something of an uninvited Sabbath. And while it's been a difficult time for many, you mentioned that some of the lessons that we could take. But I'm wondering specifically, are there other things that we could take, or maybe could have taken earlier? I remember last year when this first the COVID restrictions came upon us in March and April, the freeways, the highways, everything was just almost, you could walk across a freeway without worrying about getting hit by a car. I mean, it was just pretty isolated, desolate, and yet it was kind of a time of calm. So are there, looking back on that in hindsight, are there specific things we can learn from that and take with us as we move forward?
Yes, and probably most other people would have more to offer on the subject than I, but it's always seemed that our life is about a balance between making a living, which nearly all of us have to do, and making a life. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in the business of making a living that we realize that the intangibles of life we've forgotten about entirely. Just when 20 hours after the lockdown was announced in California last March, when all those freeways were so empty, my mother, who was 89, was raced into a hospital in an ambulance because she was losing blood. And so I had to take 3 flights back from Japan to be with her once she came out of the hospital. And of course, when I was sitting with my mother, she was in a very frail state, and I was thinking, what do I have to give to support her, to sustain her? And I quickly realized my checkbook wasn't going to be much help. My resume, useless. The books I've written, no help at all to her. The only things I could bring to that situation were whatever I'd gathered in my sort of inner savings account, my internal resources. And that would probably only come from, as you said, taking a Sabbath, going on retreat, being quiet, doing yoga, taking a walk, watching the ocean, all the many ways in which we make ourselves richer within. And in many ways, this year has been an interesting lesson for me, because nearly all my revenue has disappeared, but I feel it's been the richest year that I can remember, partly because I've got to spend much more time with my loved ones than previously. And as a writer, I've got to spend so much time at my desk. And so I think with the pandemic, clearly our first thoughts are with people who don't have a roof over their heads and don't have loved ones nearby and don't have savings in the bank. But I think for the rest of us, it's almost a choice we can make. How much to be frustrated by what we don't have, and how much to be grateful by what we still have. And again, after the fire, I realized it was up to me how I chose to direct my mind. I could think, oh, I've lost those 3 books, I've lost all my possessions. On the other hand, I could think, I've still got my life. And it's a miracle that I'm alive after being stuck in a fire for 3 hours. That's really the more important thing. And I think as we emerge from the pandemic, for all the losses that just about everybody has suffered, and I know you in particular, you lost your father a few months ago. Nonetheless, I'm so glad you're alive, your kids are alive, your grandchildren are alive. And as I say, we make our lives by how we direct our minds. And I think it's important to look for the possibility in situations rather than just what blocks us. And I find that just in an everyday way, I can't live up to it, but I'm stuck on a traffic jam. Now the freeways are crowded again, or I'm in a long line in a bank. Am I going to just spend that time fuming against this unanticipated obstruction? Or am I going to give my mind a break and allow it to roam all around? So as I say, I think the pandemic has reminded us of how helpless we are in certain ways and how powerful we are in others.
Yeah. I think, we did slow down because we simply had to. I mean, we were restricted, we were told to stay isolated and so forth. And so there were certain things that we might have expected that we would maybe learn. But I'm wondering, in your case, were there unexpected things maybe that you yourself didn't even expect, that you would find out insights about yourself or insights about your home, or that you learned as a result of this?
So many, and probably the first one is what a joy it is to be in one place. As you said in your introduction, I've been lucky enough to travel the world, and I have never regretted that. But I've also always believed, what Henry David Thoreau said, which is, it matters not how far you travel. The further, commonly, the worse. What matters is how alive you are. And one of the things that I've discovered that's most important, I think, is the wonders close to home. So when the lockdown arrived last spring, my wife and I were here in Japan, and we just started taking walks in the neighborhood. My wife is pretty much allergic to walks, or had been until last year. She likes much more strenuous exercise, but we had nowhere to go, so we just took a walk down the main drag across the street here. And after 4 minutes, we came upon this extraordinary bamboo forest with flowering cherries and nightingales teaching their young to sing. We've lived in this apartment 28 years, and we had never taken a walk 3 minutes down the main street. In other words, it opened our eyes to everything around us. And I think this has really been the year of taking nothing for granted. Again, when we flew back to be with my mother, we started taking walks every morning just up the road from her house. And she lives in a rebuilt house in those hills. And so there was often golden light in the valleys as we were walking, and other parts of the mountains were shrouded in mist. And we'd walk alone through the silence early in the morning, and we'd turn around and I'd see the Pacific Ocean scintillant in the distance and the wrinkled hills of the islands off across. And I would think, my goodness, this is as beautiful as what I would travel halfway across the world to see in Rio or Capri. And it's right in my backyard, literally. So my parents have lived in that property 55 years. And until the pandemic, I had never taken the trouble to walk to the end of the road 20 minutes away. In a small way, I've been so glad. I spent 200 straight days at my mother's dinner table last year. That hasn't happened since I was 8 years old. As a writer, I've got to spend 400 straight days at my desk. That'll never happen again. I remember 2 years ago, I was laboriously applying for a fellowship whereby I'd get 3 weeks of quiet to be a writer, never guessing that the world would give me 400 straight or 60 weeks to be a writer, thanks to the pandemic. I've got to spend every hour with my wife, which usually the world wouldn't accommodate. And everybody's circumstances are different, but to use one concrete example, maybe extreme example, last year when January dawned, my wife and I got to take a cruise around Antarctica, and it was really radiant and sublime beyond every expectation. But when we got off the ship, we had to fly from Ushuaia in Tierra del Fuego to Buenos Aires, and then from Buenos Aires to Houston, and then from Houston to LAX, and then from LAX to Santa Barbara, and then from Santa Barbara to San Francisco, and then from San Francisco to Osaka, all in maybe 4 days. So we ended up 15 hours out of sync, jet lagged. We'd flown from midsummer to midwinter overnight, which I'm not sure humans were ever meant to do. I'd probably left my alarm clock 5 hotel rooms back. We'd probably wounded the environment and maybe wounded ourselves in the process. And I think I was often living like that before, and I've been released from that now. And it's really made me think, is that a life I want to go back to? And might I not actually be getting much more sitting at home in place? So when we talk about going back to our normal lives, I think this is a rare chance to ask, were they normal before? And how, in fact, can we fashion a new normal? We otherwise never get the chance really to construct consciously a life. Now we have that chance.
Yeah. You came to mind. I was watching a movie, Up in the Air. We talked a little about this, in which George Clooney plays a character, Ryan Bingham, who travels as you do. I mean, that's his living, and his big goal was to acquire this titanium card signifying 1 million frequent flyer miles, and he gets this thing, but he gets it. He's sort of forgotten about it, and then all of a sudden they make an announcement on the plane, and the pilot, played by Sam Elliott, comes back and is that seat taken? And he sits next to him, right, and presents him with this card, and Ryan Bingham's just kind of stunned, and they chat a little bit, and then the pilot says, well, so where are you from? And Bingham pauses for a moment, and he says, I'm from here. And when he said that, I thought of you, because you have in the past, you wrote a book called The Global Soul. You've talked to and written several times about home and where is home, and can you tell us what you describe as home? I mean, you've been around traveling a lot, and you've also now, over the past year, had some time to be in one place. But has this past year affected your perception of home?
I wouldn't say the past year has, but I think the past life, my many decades on Earth, have very much. I'm so glad you mentioned that movie. I think too many of my friends thought of me when they saw it, and it was much too close to home in every sense. I saw it maybe 2 or 3 times. It seemed so wonderfully crafted. But you said in your introduction how I was born in England to parents from India. And then when I was a little kid, my parents moved to Santa Barbara, and suddenly I was this strange little mutant with an Indian face and an English voice and an American green card. And actually, even then, I thought, this is an amazing blessing. I've been given 3 pairs of eyes, 3 ways of looking at the world, and I can bring them together. I can play them off against one another. I can see California with English eyes and see England with Californian eyes, and make a kind of mix. And in those days, it was very, very unusual. And now I'm guessing many of the people listening to us, so many of the people around Los Angeles or Toronto or Sydney or London, my background seems simple by comparison. The kids of the 21st century are much more international than I am, that they have parents from one place, partners from another, a residence somewhere else, dreams somewhere else. And I think, in fact, the question, where do you come from, is less and less important. Much more important is, where are you going? I don't think we can be defined by our origins in the way we used to. Luckily, we've been liberated from that. And we can be defined much more by our passions than by our passports, perhaps. And I think this, I'd always believed this, but it really did come home to me when the fire burnt down my home, because the next morning when I woke up, I had no physical property. If somebody said, where do you live? I couldn't point to any structure. And it reminded me that really home is what lives inside me. Home was not a physical property. It was my mother, my wife, my favorite song, the hermitage that I returned to. It was what sustains me. That home has very little for me to do with a piece of soil, much more to do with a piece of soul. And I think many people in Los Angeles now also know that home is a work in progress. It's a collage, and we're constantly adding new pieces to it. So I grew up, fortunately, with pieces of India and England and California inside me. I moved to Japan, so that became part of the stained glass picture. I spent a lot of time in Cuba and Thailand and Tibet. So every day almost, it seems that new elements are coming into my life, and that home is a sentence I'll never complete. It's a question I don't have to answer. And I feel an instant kin with many people in Los Angeles, because if I meet somebody who's half Thai and half Swedish and on his way to New York City, I say, oh, I know exactly where you're coming from, as it were. We belong to the same group. And again, as I say, when I was a little kid, I could never have imagined that when you set foot in London or Toronto today, the average person you meet was born in a foreign country. In other words, in our cities, to be a foreigner is the norm now. And I belong to a huge tribe that's growing every day, and once had somebody in the White House for 8 years. So I'm very glad that the sense of home has really been expanded. I think in my grandparents' age, they were given a sense of home when they were born and told, this is your territory, those are your enemies over there, this is your caste, this is your religion. And now we've been freed from all that, and it brings challenges, because we have to consciously determine where we belong and where we stand. But it's much better to have too many choices than too few. And I think I feel very grateful that home has never been a fixed object for me.
Yeah. You know, what you were just speaking about here, and also something you mentioned when you were speaking at Laverne 20 years ago, and I still remember some of what you said back then, having to do with the mix of ethnicities and backgrounds and cultures. I think one of the things you mentioned was, you know, in a few generations, everybody's going to be sort of, you know, mixed race. Everybody's going to look sort of cappuccino. We're all going to just be together. And that struck with me because, you know, I mean, well, you know, you mentioned President Obama. He's, you know, half white, half black. My daughter, her husband's father is ethnically Mexican, so Eric is half, and my grandkids are, I guess, a quarter. You know, there's going to be this blending. I wondered if you could comment a little at this point, given especially in the U.S., the divisions that we're seeing, and so much racism just bubbling beneath the surface and often erupting, what we might learn, what you can share with us about learning to not just tolerate, but accept and rejoice in our shared multiculturalism.
I think just interacting with everybody on an individual basis, which sounds silly and self-evident, but I think the reason that tribalism is on the rise is that tribalism is on the run in some ways. The reason that there's much more nationalism is that people can feel that all those borders are being blurred, and they want to pull us back into a past where things were black and white, very clear, rather than into this technicolor future where it's much harder to know exactly where you stand. But they can't, because, as you say, incrementally, individual by individual, we're crossing borders. Your grandson is heir to two cultures, probably will grow up speaking two two different languages. Here in Japan, somebody who was half Japanese and half American used to be called a hafu, and it was a rather derogatory phrase. Now they say, no, we're doubles. We're actually richer than most people would be, because we have access to two whole universes, not just to a single one. And I'm always struck by the fact that we're so caught up in the moment now. I think sometimes we have a hard time seeing the bigger picture. But if you check the statistics, you will find that in 1958, 97% of Americans were against mixed race marriages. By 2014, the figure was 3%. That's a very, very radical change in my lifetime alone, from 97% to 3% to, and as you say, to Barack Obama being the norm, or Tiger Woods, or Naomi Osaka, or so many of our heroes from every sphere now have many different places inside them. Look at Kamala Harris, half Jamaican and half Indian, and a woman who's vice president. So I think the world is only moving in that direction, much as people are trying to pull us back. And I think, especially in Los Angeles, culturally, we're all aware our food is much more interesting than it used to be. Our films, our music is a wonderful mongrel mix of things. And our friendships are much more diverse than they used to be. I happened to meet recently an old friend of mine who'd been in my class in the 4th grade in England. And he confessed to me, now that we're getting old, that when he came into the classroom at the age of 9 and he saw me there, he had never seen a dark-skinned person before. He's a very cosmopolitan guy. He grew up in London in the 1960s. He'd never seen dark skin till the age of 9. And he has 4 daughters. And he tells me now that when his 4 daughters bring their friends home, they don't even bother to say so-and-so's from Nigeria, so-and-so's from Pakistan. So they just say, oh, these are Londoners. And we'll always have tribes. It's in the nature of the humanity to define an us by creating a them. So I don't think that'll ever go away. But I don't think tribes based on nationality or race or ethnicity are going to last much longer, because we're all over the place. And when you mentioned President Obama, as I did, I think one of the beauties of his global perspective was he couldn't see things in black and white, because he wasn't black and he wasn't white. And every such division is slowly being exploded, and probably not happening as quickly as we would like, but much, much more quickly than I imagined. And when I think back to when I was a kid, things seem so antediluvian then. And when I meet people of your grandkids' generation, or even of Levan student age, I probably look like a Neanderthal to them, because they just take for granted that they look across their classroom, there's somebody from Guatemala, and there's somebody from Iran, and there's somebody from Vietnam, and there's somebody from Haiti. And as far as they're concerned, they're all classmates and friends, or maybe enemies, but not on the basis of their race. And I do think the world is much more colorblind than it was previously.
Well, I certainly hope so. In fact, just as you met, one of my students in one of my classes this semester is taking the class from El Salvador. You can be anywhere.
Yes,
You
yes.
really. And so another one in Philadelphia. Anyway, just I don't know if many of our listeners are aware, but you actually had a chance to speak on the beach in Hawaii with President Obama when he was a senator, right?
Yes, the week before he declared his campaign run for the presidency, so January 2007. I met him just in a little burger joint, and I didn't recognize him, but luckily I was with a friend who did. And he was at this table of 16 people, all in flip-flops and t-shirts and shorts, and some of them had kind of Asian features, and some of them had African-American features, and some had a mixture of both. And there was this skinny teenager at the center of the table who was going to collect avocado burgers for everyone, and that turned out to be Mr. Obama. And the friend I was with was very determined to go and interrupt him in this family conversation, because he was confident, as very few people were then, that Mr. Obama would win. So we disturbed him in the middle of his meal, and he jumped up and engaged us in the most sparkling literary conversation either of us can remember having. My friend was a writer too. Mr. Obama had read his books. He just read the book that you mentioned, Cuba in the Night, because he knew that Cuba was an important part of his agenda. And he couldn't have been more charming. So as writers, we were thinking that we certainly know who we were going to vote for in 2008. And I was telling many of my friends, not facetiously, that probably the best travel writer in America got lost to the White House when he won the election, because his first book is as wise and as full of feeling and as full of thought about the global world that we're entering, and its challenges as well as its possibilities, as any book I've read. I mean, he's really got a remarkable gift for the written word, as is evident now by the reading lists he brings out every few months. And anybody who wants to be informed about the world on an emotional as well as on a political level should just follow President Obama's reading lists, I think.
Yeah. Certainly you and your experience, and many of the people I'm sure watching this conversation are open to and delighted in the variety of cultures, and eager to speak with people who come from different backgrounds. But as we were just mentioning, there are certainly people who are fearful of that kind of thing. Just before we move on, I want to move on to back to our topic, but can you talk about, offer a specific suggestion for something or things that we can do when dealing with somebody who is so afraid of the other, of another culture, in an attempt, what can we do to help build bridges and calm fears in light of this rampant racism that we're dealing with now?
Well, I'll give an example. I was once climbing up a hill here in Japan, in Hiroshima, with the Dalai Lama. And a young woman came and broke through the crowd and started shouting, "Dalai Lama, I need to talk to you." And we went into a little temple and we sat there quietly, and the Dalai Lama prayed for a little and blessed the temple. That's the reason he was there. And I could hear her shouting outside. And I thought, oh my goodness, what's going to happen when we come out? And she's waiting to accost him. And when we did come out, to my surprise, he didn't tell his bodyguards, "Oh, please take her away." He told them, "Please bring her towards me." And he just cupped her face in his hands. And he looked at her and he communicated as well as he could. And I think he was really saying, we have as much in common as apart. I'm not your enemy. I don't have anything against you. If you do have a complaint, please give it to me. But remember that there are probably 98% of the things that join us. We're the same humans with the same fears and hopes and sufferings. And again, you can choose whether to concentrate on what separates or what unites us. Just yesterday, I was reading a beautiful piece by a friend of mine who's an Episcopalian rector in Richmond, Virginia. And he wrote a piece about white privilege. And somebody wrote to him in his congregation very angrily and said, "I can't believe what you wrote, and I don't want to have anything to do with you, and I'm leaving your church." And my friend wrote back to him and I said, I quite understand. There are probably other churches that are better for you. And I'm more than able to make mistakes. 90% of what I do is wrong. And I'm so sorry if I offended you. And his antagonist wrote back and said, "Well, actually, I agree with you on 95% of the things. It's just 5% of what you said that I'm afraid I can't be with." And my friend, and they started corresponding. And then the angry person sent my friend some pictures of his granddaughter. And my friend said, "Oh, isn't she sweet?" and sent back. And instantly they were talking about that 95%. It doesn't always work. But again, I think one of the things that my friend was showing me in the story he shared was humility. And just to acknowledge that I'm not in the right, I'm sorry if I've offended you. And sorry is a much more inviting word than many another word that we might use. Suddenly he was changing the discourse to a place where they could talk about what they had in common, rather than an argument that neither of us was ever going to win. So let's say I have friends who are on the different side of the political debate than I. But their parents, their grandparents, they're scared of the pandemic, they're sick, they're losing loved ones. That's the place to talk to them. We'll never come to any agreement politically, but there's so much else where their situation and poignancy and problems are mine, and vice versa.
Thank you. Years ago, when you first came to Japan, you had the idea you were going to live for a year in a monastery. And I think that lasted a week.
Yes.
But you spent the year, though, in Japan, and it changed your life. You wrote about that year in The Lady and the Monk. And now 3 decades later, you wrote a book about your life in Japan called Autumn Light. Fascinating book. And I'm wondering what 30 years of living in Japan has taught you.
Thank you. I think maybe it's taught me how to listen, because I was trained to speak a lot, not so much to listen. I think it's trained me how to be a little more invisible than I was before, because I was trained to push myself forwards in England and California and Boston and New York. And I think it's trained me to think in terms of community more. So I notice when I'm taking a walk, I was taking out the trash earlier this morning, and I reflexively started picking up any trash I saw on the streets. I'd never done that when I was living in Santa Barbara or Oxford or Boston. There's a sense of responsibility and attentiveness, and defining yourself in terms of the larger whole in Japan that I hadn't encountered so much before. And I came here very much as a student, thinking of Japan as a wise elder that's lived for 1500 years with earthquake and forest fire and warfare, and knows how to live in the face of suffering and mortality. And this actually speaks to the pandemic too, that I think when the pandemic broke out last year, of course, everybody around me here in Japan was worried, but they were also humble enough to know that so much that happens takes place beyond our control anyway. So they weren't complaining, they weren't shocked. They didn't say, oh, reality's played a dirty trick on us and stripped us of our dreams and plans. They thought, well, as ever, reality is the partner with which we have to make our futures. And we have to listen to what nature or the fates or the heavens are giving us and work with that. And you mentioned my book, Autumn Light, and it was really meant to be about two things, living with mortality and living with uncertainty. And I brought it out 8 months before the pandemic, not knowing that these would be very intense questions for all our global neighbors. But I do feel we're always in that state. The pandemic has only dramatized what is always the case, which is a year from now, I can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. I can't tell you what's going to happen tonight. And 3 years ago, I couldn't either. And so I think we have to be attentive to the prompts all around us, and just to be reminded we can't fashion our own lives exactly the way we would choose, but we have to live with necessity and constraint and the very specific limit that is the end of our lives. And I feel that Japan has lived that very well for a long time. Everybody saw after the tsunami, when 18,500 people were swept to their deaths overnight. If you watched on television, most of the people in Japan weren't complaining. They weren't obviously grieving, partly because they knew if they had lost their son and their daughter, their neighbor had probably lost as much, maybe more. And that the best thing that they could offer to their neighbor was, again, goes back to your earlier question, a sense of what we've all gone through together. Rather than fastening on your individual loss, think in terms of the larger circle. And it's really hard to do, but it's certainly more constructive than just fighting with reality, because that's a fight you'll never win. All your time is wasted.
Yeah. Just one more question about Japan before I move on to my final question for you. Now, you're very observant and astute student of human nature and cultures and so forth. And certainly, as you've mentioned, living in Japan has caused you to listen more and be more attentive. But I'm curious, what has ping pong taught you?
Not to try to win. And so when I started playing ping pong in my neighborhood here in Japan, I play with my elderly neighbors, many of them in their 80s. The first thing that took me by surprise was we always play doubles. The second was we play best of two, which means that often it's 1-1. There's no winner. The third thing that took me by surprise is we choose our partners by lot, and we change our partners every 6 minutes after every game. So if you happen to win once, you're probably going to lose 6 minutes from now. On the other hand, if you happen to lose now, you'll win 6 minutes from now. And at the end of 90 minutes of furious ping pong among, say, 20 people, everyone feels like a winner. We've all had a good time because that everybody's keeping track of who's the score in the game to make it interesting, but nobody's keeping track of who's won. And so when I come back home and my wife says, how was the ping pong? I never say, it was really frustrating because I lost. And I never say, oh, fantastic because I won. I said, fantastic, because we all won. And when I come back to LA, I play my arch rival, who's from England, and he's furiously competitive. So we have terrifying games. And if I happen to win, I can't sleep that night because I know he's going to be seeking revenge the next time. And if I lose, of course, I can't sleep that night because, oh, why did I blow that backhand topspin in the fourth game? And so actually, I am always a loser if I'm trying to keep score. And of course, there are drawbacks in the Japanese way of doing things. But to somebody who grew up with this sense of dog-eat-dog competition, and the only way of getting ahead is ensuring that other people are losers, it's a much lovelier way of thinking of things. And I know you're a great musician, and I feel that Japan really works like a symphony orchestra. And so each person plays her part, but only with a view to a larger harmony. And it's not about playing your part better than everybody else. It's about playing it in tune with everybody else. And so a ping pong game is not a competition so much as a dance, or even an act of love in Japan. Now, I know Felicia has some questions from the audience, and I don't know if we have to go over to her now or whether you have more.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. I wanted to give you one last chance to, got one final question before we switch over to short and direct. It's a simple, direct question. Where do you find hope?
In the young people, in probably communities such as the students of Laverne, none of whom can imagine how divided the world was when I was a kid. And we're all painfully conscious of how divided and full of rage and full of ideology the world is now. But on a person-by-person level, I think it was much worse when I was a kid. And in terms of the rights for minorities, the rights for women, the rights for LGBT community, the strides made in the last 40 years are extraordinary and unimaginable. I couldn't have thought in 1975 that we would have a half Kenyan, half Kansan president and a half Indian, half Jamaican vice president. That just didn't, and it was unimaginable in the US then and unimaginable in many places now. So I think people who are caught up in the news, which is only about things that are going wrong, miss sometimes the larger arc where things are moving, I think, just as Gandhi or Martin Luther King would have hoped, towards the larger arc of justice. And things are slowly getting better, decade by decade. Though if you look at it moment by moment, there's always something to be aggrieved about and furious about, probably, in terms of injustice. I should say, just before I end, 2 years ago, for the first time in 37 years, I returned to a classroom to teach for one semester back east for 3 months. The kids were much brighter than I and my friends were. They were much more polite, much more gracious, and much more efficient. But most of all, they were much more globally aware. And they weren't all privileged, but even the ones who weren't so privileged and hadn't had the chance to travel much, when they looked across the room and they saw, as I was saying before, another student from Korea or El Salvador or Tunisia, weren't surprised at all and were eager to find out what that person could bring to the conversation from her perspective. And in all those ways, on a person-by-person level, the world is moving inexorably towards more understanding.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that, and that gives me hope. And yes, this has been great. But I'll turn it over to Felicia now, because I believe we may have received some questions in our chat room from listeners. So, Felicia.
Yes, in fact, we have a number of questions in chat. But before I get to those questions, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Pico. Thank you, Randy, for taking over the questions. But don't go away yet, because there's more coming. There's questions coming, right? So consider this a very brief interlude. I'm Felicia Beardsley. I'm director of the Cultural and Natural History Collections at the university. And again, I want to thank Pico for agreeing to be our speaker in this new series on influential voices. And I really want to thank June Pulcini. This was her brainstorm. This entire series. She provided some of the first seed funding for this series. So really, we are really, truly grateful to June for that. Again, thank you, Randy, as our guest interviewer and coordinator for the speaker series. I want to thank Ann Collier, who is the curator for our collections, and Lucero Rojo, who is our University Advancement Connection. We will, as a reminder, be hosting another dialogue in the fall, though we're still working on who it might be. Although Pico did say he's willing to come back again and again and again. And for those of you who are new to us, the Cultural Natural History Collections is the original museum for the university. We've been around as long as the university has been, since 1891, so 130 years. So we currently house over 100,000 objects that represent the entire history of our planet, literally. But here's the key part. We are run solely and completely on donations without financial support from the university because they're busy supporting our students. That's okay, right? So if you are so inclined, please feel free to open your pocketbooks and donate to us, and consider this might be a perfect time for the gift that keeps on giving, like a graduation gift, as an example. And it allows us to continue to meet our own mission, and that's the care and conservation of the collective history of our world, and to foster shared experiences that resonate across generations and help envision a more united community. So please donate. The link's in the chat. And again, thank you for joining us. So let's actually get to some questions. All right, we have actually several questions. But one of them that I hope you can address is, how has the pandemic affected spirituality in Japan?
I'm not sure it's affected spirituality in Japan, that everybody's been going to the shrine to pray for their loved ones and to speak to their departed ones. But I think it's affected spirituality everywhere because it's turned us back to the inner life. We've been reminded that the inner life is really what sustains us more than anything. And it's brought us back to essential things. I noticed right when the pandemic broke out, I started getting long letters from old friends whom I've known since I was 8 years old. And they weren't writing about the Super Bowl or Meghan and Harry or what was happening with the Kardashians. They were writing about uncertainty and family and death. Really important things. And so I feel that our conversation's been much more serious. And I think of the definition of spirituality as just the inner life. It doesn't have to do with text or denominations or capital letters. It's just what goes on inside you in your relations to the universe and the people you care about. And I think the pandemic has really drawn our attention much more to that and reminded us that that's the indispensable part of our lives. And to go back to Randy's question about hope, I think of one of the great moments in my life came when the playwright Václav Havel became president of Czechoslovakia, suddenly, 7 weeks after being in prison. And he said, hope isn't the confidence that everything will turn out right, because it won't. It's the confidence that everything makes sense in a larger scheme. And it's probably a scheme beyond what we can see, but there is an order to things. You know, William James said that we human beings are like dogs in a library. We're surrounded by incredible wisdom, but just in a language we can't follow. But that doesn't mean that the wisdom isn't there. And so, you know, I think the universe has more logic and sense to it than we do. And although we can't perceive the larger pattern of things, probably there is one playing out.
And building on that, could you actually reflect on the human nature relationship and what it's meant, or has your perspective changed since you've been kind of forced to sit still during this pandemic?
I suppose it's a reminder of our frailty, which is always what brings us together. I mean, I think I'm not a Buddhist, but I think the first principle of Buddhism might be that everybody suffers, that suffering is an equal opportunity employer. And it goes back to really Randy's question. When we meet somebody, are we going to see her in terms of her race or political position, or in terms of her suffering? And I think if we see her in terms of her suffering, we're instantly on the same side, we're brought together. And in a certain way, we're all aware of how, as ever, the poor suffer more than the rich in a pandemic or in any situation. But I do think that the virus has been a great democrat. And what people are going through in Iran and China and Brazil and Southern California is more or less the same. We're all dealing with the same fears. And I think in that way, human relationships, we're reminded to see the rest of the world, not in terms of abstractions, but in terms of human beings, that Iran is not a dictatorship that's opposed to Washington. It's a collection of 70 million people who probably were worried about their spouses and their parents and their kids exactly the way we in the United States are.
Okay, well, thank you. And then a question about our students. Our students actually feel that they are deprived of reasons for optimism about the future. A lot of them because of the economic burdens they are suffering, because of limited opportunities, at least compared to previous generations. So, and then of course, there's the big threat of environmental catastrophe. How should we address that? What do you
Well,
suggest?
I'm so glad that came up, because I do feel that the pandemic has in some ways obscured the fact that our major three issues are exactly the same as they were 2 years ago. And exactly as your question suggests, the climate crisis is the main thing we have to worry about, the refugee crisis, the second, and the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, perhaps the third. And I think in the larger scheme of things, the pandemic is a blip, and those others are very, very urgent. And they've probably been made worse by the pandemic. At the same time, I do have faith in the young. I mean, it's the young who've been taking the lead in terms of climate change. The others of us, people of my age, are stuck in our habits and our routines. And it's Greta Thunberg and her generation that's been saying, we've got to wake up and change things. And the odds are very much against us. But the fact that our attention is being drawn to it is really, really important. The one thing, so my heart goes out to somebody who's 21 years old now, trying to find a job, as you said, in a very battered economy with the climate change, climate crisis looming over us. I think the question was speaking about unprecedented problems, and I'm not sure they're unprecedented. In my parents' generation, they were growing up with World War II that went on for 5 years or longer here in Japan, and that probably seemed pretty all-consuming. And I remember when I was a kid, we were growing up in the middle of the Cold War and the nuclear threat, and that seemed maybe almost as terrifying as climate change does now. It goes back in some ways to one of Randy's questions about the Sabbath, in the sense that the good thing about climate change is that it's caused by humans, and therefore it has to be solved by humans, and it has to be solved by humans working together. Just as with the virus, it's not the fault of any particular individual or nation, it's everyone, and it can only be solved by everybody working together. So although it's a terrifying prospect, I think the nature of reality is to present us with terrifying prospects. And this particular one, because we've created, we have to solve. And that's exactly how I feel about when Randy was asking about the internet Sabbath. I feel that many of us are controlled by our devices, but that's not the fault of the devices, that's the fault of us. And so since the problem lies in us, not our machines, so does the solution. So I'm grateful for the energy, and I'm grateful for what hopefulness there is in the younger generation, but I think they will get through their problems just as every generation previously has got through ours.
Okay, and I think we have just like a minute or two left. And we do have some questions related to economies and changing political regimes. And do you see kind of a shift in how we might conduct our sort of global economics in terms of tourism, in terms of changes in regimes, opening up boundaries and so on?
The more boundaries open, the better. Throughout this conversation, I felt woefully ill-equipped and ill-qualified to answer these questions. There are many wiser people who should be offering answers, and particularly with this one. I think most of the people listening to this conversation probably have better answers than I do. I was lucky enough 2 years ago, I spent 7 months crisscrossing the world, traveling with my 2 books. So I was 3 times in Europe and 2 times in Asia, and traveling back and forth across North America. And I came out of that 7 months of travel feeling that the United States was maybe 15 years behind Europe and Canada and 25 years behind Asia. So certainly there's been a great tilt in power. I grew up the last years of the American Empire, and now we're living in some very different kind of planet. But whenever I'm a little worried about the US, I look at Canada, our neighbor, which is working with very similar circumstances, albeit with a much smaller population. And Canada seems to me to be one of the most forward-thinking and enlightened cultures on earth. It's certainly taken in the whole world, from President Trudeau in the 1970s, realizing we're entering a global reality and throwing his arms around it rather than resisting it. In fact, everybody is bilingual. Whenever you're traveling anywhere in the world, 30% of the people you meet seem to be from Canada. So I think if Canada can be such a healthy part of the global community, the United States can catch up with Canada at some point. And I think the fact that we're consciously aware that we're part of a global neighborhood, which wasn't the case when I was growing up, already is a big step forwards.
Well, thank you so much for that. And we want to thank you for participating in Influential Voices and in this, new speaker series that we have. This, in fact, we've kind of come to the end of our time. So this concludes our program for today. And once again, thank you so much, Pico, for agreeing to join us. Thank you, Randy.
Sure.
And thank you to everybody else. And we hope to see you back in the fall for another conversation with an influential voice. With that, we are concluding our event.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Thank you to everybody who's joined us, and please all stay very well. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. We're done. I know we still are recording, but let me stop recording.